G'day guys. This video is on the current crisis in food, energy and the likes, and what's been discussed and what isn't being discussed in that regard. Let me just share my screen. This guy here, Dimitris Yatsos, is basically what you could say a geopolitical type journalist that looks into this sort of stuff, and he spoke to an American military senior military officer general, and basically this whole conflict of this, let's wear down, is it wearing down Russia, or is it wearing down Europe to be brought under the Biden wing, so to speak? And he sort of said, oh, well, the Russians are carving up the place, they're basically Zelensky Timazi Yatin Villatu sto Miami. So they're preparing a Miami villa for him when he has to leave, so his own countrymen don't tear him to bits. Pretty much, we've been told, well, this whole conflict has been disastrous for the world. And as I've talked about in my other video, I sort of covered on some of the food supply insecurities and issues like that. But I actually did mention the countries that primarily import food from the Ukraine that would be primarily affected, because they have to go into the open markets. But looking at the sort of data, I decided, let me do a bit of a deep dive into the actual data itself. How much is it really affected? So I found this site here. It's called basically Atlas Big, and it actually has all these stats that pulls in on all different countries, like agricultural production of countries. And it basically has, wheat production, cereal production, barley, the total cereal production, lentils, rice, corn, oats, beans, you name it, vegetables, fruits and stuff like that. Obviously, the fruits are primarily, you'll find most of them in the tropical sort of areas, and some of the others, like, your apricots and stuff like that in the more temperate climates and stuff like that. But whatever else, so spices, other things like cotton producing hops, sugar beets, obviously, Russia and the Ukraine, the US tend to be big sugar beet producers, where sugar cane is sort of Australia and even the US and some other countries and all that. So it gives you an idea of the sort of different products out there, all these sort of things. And it's in other languages as well. This is English US, but you will find in other languages. So you can get all sorts of information. It gives you a bit of a rundown on all that. He actually said that the amount, and this is where, he said, well, the actual amount isn't very big. It's, a bit over 2%. So I looked at the data on the world total cereal production by country. Obviously, the first one is China. That's all cereals, including, China will have more rice compared to other countries, which will have more, other, they may have wheat or barley or whatever else. And so when we're looking at these sort of countries around the world, so come down to the Ukraine. That's the Ukraine. So 74 million plus tons. Divide that by the global, which is nearly 3 billion tons. And there you've got your 2.5%, 2.4989. So you have to times it by 100. Because just remember, you will divide that by 100 to get that 0.024, so 2.5%. So it's pretty much on the ball. So really, you know, a lot of people have been blaming Russia for the food shortages and the food cost and all that. You know, let's take a look at these sort of countries. You know, China. Represents, in terms of cereal production, about 20, nearly 21%. The US, India probably uses most of that domestically, doesn't export much. Exports some, but not a lot. They don't have a very efficient production. So even though it's one of their biggest industries, it's just basically still very efficient. 14.1% for the US, as you can see. And the US tends to basically does export part of it. Australia, even though it's got about a third of what Ukraine, about 29,000, it's still, which is very little in comparison. You know, 74, 2.5. So Australia's would be nearly, just slightly less than 1% of global production of total cereals. So way over. Obviously, it doesn't have 1% of the population, because then Australia would have the equivalent of well over 70 million to have 1% of the population, but it's only got 25 approximately. As I said, Australia basically produces 3 times the amount that it consumes, that it, you know, in terms of that. So it's a net exporter of cereals globally. So when we take a look at, you know, obviously rice, China's going to be India, Indonesia, and all the other sort of countries. As you can see, even the United States is, you know, 10 million, China's 211, India's 160, Indonesia 77, Bangladesh 52. So when it comes to this, you know, pretty much rice is still a product that's primarily produced in Asia. And that's because of the Himalayas. The Himalayas in this sort of part here basically provide a lot of the Himalayan plateau, a lot of the silt and replenishment of water. And you get more water into China and into India, which facilitate rice production far better than in other parts of the world. It's one of those products that needs more water. So it will always tend to be those countries in Asia will tend to dominate, that are around the Tibetan plateau will tend to dominate because of those vast river systems, which they can actually provide siltation and nutrients and additional water. They are tropical, many of them down here as well, but also in China where they're subtropical or less than that. It's just basically the excess water and all that you can actually fill up rice paddies. It's just the nature of the beast. So that's that. Now, when we look at other products like wheat, obviously China's number one. You know, this is world wheat. India is second. The Russian Federation is third. Then the United States, then France, then Canada, and then the Ukraine. So even here, wheat, when we're looking at wheat as a percentage, for the Ukraine, I'll bring that back here. There's the Ukraine numbers divided by, so 3.7%. It's still not going to be a massive thing. I mean, Russia could have a bigger effect on that supply for the reason that it is a very much a big producer. It represents nearly 10%. So it's going to have a bigger effect. But when it comes to wheat, it's very distributed throughout the world. You know, there's millions in multiple countries and all that. So wheat is one of those products that isn't going to be a big problem. It will be for countries that are dependent on imports. Like, for instance, you know, you got Australia with 17 million, 17.6, you know, and so Greece has got about 1 million. As an example, I'll give you an example. And, you know, Egypt, which is a bigger consumer of it, it's got about 9, but they've got about 100 million population, 10 times. So their production is slightly, per capita, is slightly lower than Greece. But Greece doesn't consume a lot of, you know, when it comes to wheat products. Yes, a bit of bread, but that's about it. Where places like Egypt, you know, since antiquity are very much big bread eaters, you know, so they consume quite a lot of wheat in comparison. So for them, most of their contracts are from countries that, like the Ukraine or Russia, which is cheaper. The problem is, it's not so much countries like the Ukraine, it's countries like Russia that are really having the effect. So when you put sanctions on these countries, obviously they're going to go, well, we're not going to sell you stuff. You've sanctioned us. So, and they can have a bigger, more profound effect. So it's really the sanctions that are causing some of these issues in supply, not the war as much, but the sanctions. They basically boomeranged and hit the West, primarily Europe. You know, when we look at other things like corn, you know, again, this is corn production. That's the Ukraine. Still, the US is the biggest producer globally. Corn production, 3%, 3.1%. Still, large majority of these grains are not being affected by the war. So all the stuff that you've been told that is the war is nonsense. Now, that doesn't mean that certain countries like Egypt and others and Indonesia and a few other countries that have got contracts with the Ukraine, they are being affected, but they're not being affected because of the amount of produced in the world. You know, it's more having to do with other things. So it's not the quantity, but they don't have contracts. So they have to go into the open market. And the open market is where speculators are inflating. But there are reasons why. I mean, speculators don't emerge speculators just take opportunity. You know, they're out there to make a quid. But really, the thing that's actually really causing these problems and exacerbating these problems is the supply chain. To transport things. Remember, when, you know, let me just go through some of these initially. We'll cover some of these. You know, when you're looking at oats, again, the Ukraine doesn't produce a lot. It's all the way down here. So as you can see, Russia produces 10 times the amount. So it's the sanctions that are affecting Russian exports to the West, to Europe for oats, not the war. Lentils, that's not going to be affected. But even again, it's the Russian Federation that produces far more than Ukraine. The Ukraine even produces less than Greece. That's only got a 10 million population, 10.6, 10.8 million population. So just to give you a comparison, and they're in the 50 odd million. So Canada's the biggest producer of lentils. Doesn't surprise me with all the vagoons there. Then barley, again, the Ukraine, this amount. We'll just go through the percentages. I think it's really important to realise that the percentages aren't massive. So 5.6%. That's the highest out of all of them. So what is barley used for? Oh, beer. Oh, you poor Germans. Your beer is going to become expensive. Yes, the next beer fest isn't going to be a happy one. And, barley, it's, if you look, Russia, plus the Ukraine, divided by 79610. It's about 18.5%. There you're getting into some numbers, but obviously it's still less than 20% of that means it's about nearly 1/5 of the global production. And obviously, this is a smaller percentage, as we saw. The big percentage is Russia. Again, it's the sanctions that are affecting the supply. But it's not only that. So there's your total numbers. Anybody asks you, you go, that's the amount against that amount. And it's pretty much 74.4 million tonnes divided by nearly 3 billion tonnes of cereals. That's the number that's being affected, 2.5%. So it's not massive to cause a lot of these problems. So where are these problems coming from? So I talk to people that get things in containers or stuff over here. Do people realize that container costs have gone up 4 times? Not once, not like double, 4 times. So to basically get a container load of stuff from any part of the world has gone up 4 times. How did that supply chain get stuffed up like that? Would COVID have something to do with it? The lockdowns? I suspect so. Let's not forget, because of the lockdowns, because of the supply chain disruptions that actually happened, even some of the Greek ship owners actually got rid of some of their older ships. Actually, at the moment, to get LNG out of the Eastern Mediterranean, they are literally going gangbusters trying to build new LNG ships. That's the Greek tycoons. Actually, they started before the crisis because they actually knew that crisis would start. So they're way ahead of the ball at the moment, luckily, because then we'd have even a bigger supply problem in terms of transporting LNG. It'd even be worse than it is currently. So that these were smart businessmen that actually thought ahead and realized the opportunity would be there to transport LNG. That's why we've got the biggest merchant navy in the world. It's not accidental. It's because these guys are smart. They really know their shit when it comes to maritime industry. They can detect how it actually goes and all that. They can feel it. They can feel it in their soul, So they're pretty good at that. They've been doing it for a long time, those families that are involved in the ship building and ship owning industries in Greece. So they were proactive, and that's why it's not as bad transporting energy. But pretty much the woke brigade that basically created the COVID lockdowns, the woke brigade that basically underinvested in petrochemicals, because, even now, the lunatics, they're nearly turning off the lights in Germany and the rest of Europe. And what are these lunatics doing? Oh, they want more windmills and solar farms. How crazy can you get? How ridiculous. Brussels have lost the plot. They should just bulldoze those whole buildings where those bureaucrats are in. I'm not saying do something like that, not anything criminal, but I'm saying that, figuratively speaking, they're a waste of space. They're just coming up with these woke ideas, which are not going to help the planet. There's going to be a lot of people that are starving, in the future. It's just bloody madness what is happening. And it's due to basically a supply chain that got disrupted completely because people overreacted. I mean, you've seen my video. I'll put it up here, the UK one, whoever hasn't seen it, quite clearly when we do a comparison between the flu pandemic in 89, 90 and the recent COVID with a larger population, with more comorbidities, a younger population back then, smaller population, and still the numbers were larger then than what they are today. That tells you everything, that we overreacted and we upended the entire system. A whole lot of tech giants and a whole lot of very wealthy bankers became very bloody rich because they were able to inflate a whole lot of assets, print shitloads of money, and pretty much, like the Davos people said, well, you don't need anything. We'll own it all and you'll be happy. And pretty much, that is sort of what is happening. And it doesn't seem like they really care. They're on their agenda. They're pursuing their agenda. And they're basically pointing the finger elsewhere, redirecting, when really it's the supply chain that they stuffed up that's actually costing. I mean, Greek ship owners can put a number of ships out. Nobody else did, only they. They were proactive because they could see the future. But remember, they only represent 20% of global maritime activity. A lot of the other maritime companies didn't do any of that. So there is still less capacity out there, one. Two, a lot of the supply chains within countries has been completely disrupted because of COVID, and they are slowly being re-established. A lot of businesses went out of business in that period. And as a consequence, it's not only the big players that do the big bulk stuff, but there's also the intermediate and smaller companies, courier companies and all that, that move stuff around. Some of them did okay. Some of them went bust, especially the intermediate ones, not the very local ones and not the large ones which had a more fat and able to survive. But those intermediate ones, they are the ones that got annihilated. And that's where the whole system's got broken as a consequence. Then you've got, on the other hand, all these underinvestment in petrochemical products. And then all of a sudden, you create a war, conflict, basically to reassert, Biden's dominance of senility. And basically, they have made a mess of it. They've upended Europe completely. Basically, they might as well turn off the lights in Europe. That's how bad it is. But that's what's been happening. I mean, it's just crazy. There's this other guy that I came across. I'll just share this screen. This guy here, Yorgos Romanos, he's a guy that actually looks into all these sort of nefarious things that happen with different. This is about the Antonov aircraft that fell in Greece, which is a very interesting thing. All these. I mean, if you remember, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, there are a lot of merchants of death. Basically weapons smugglers, ex-CIA people, from intelligence forces, and they move stuff around and all that. I mean, the things that they get involved. The company that one of these aircrafts was a subsidiary of a bigger company that was set up in 2003 called Meridian. And Meridian, like your meridians, anybody that understands geography and knows what I mean, they basically, the parent companies in the US. There's a UK, subsidiary and a Ukrainian one. The Ukrainian one only has 3 aircraft. One of those fell. and they're involved in moving NATO weapons to the Ukraine. So I wonder why it was flying from the Ukraine. Apparently it landed in, we don't know whether it, supposedly they picked up stuff, but did they in Serbia? And then it moved on. It was going to go to United Arab Emirates, and from there on, its final destination was in Dhaka, Bangladesh, apparently. But you never know where things can end. These people have been involved in all sorts of nefarious things, like moving weapons to Southeast Asia, Western Central Africa, the Middle East, both illegal items and weapons. But also they work for our favourite two organisations, the Red Cross and the UN, in doing humanitarian shipments. Surprise, surprise. They get really involved in all sorts of things. Now, apparently there's a guy who the person who owns the subsidiary called, let me just see his name, Alejandro Bogdanovich. So ALEJANDROBOGDANOVICH. So I had to write this down because can't expect me to remember all this sort of little detailed stuff. So he basically set up an offshore limited company in our lovely Cyprus. It's called DSE Incorporated Limited. It was set up on the 12th of the 7th, 2018. So in July, 12th of July, 2018, this was set up. It was a limited company incorporated in Cyprus. People that don't know this, Cyprus does a lot of, let's say, their banks do a lot of movement of money. If you want to move stuff around without really having others being able to check it, Cyprus is a pretty good place to utilize. A lot of the intelligence agents use it, and a lot of the intelligence agents base themselves in there. So it's well known to be, let's say, an intelligence hotspot for US, British in particular, but also other intelligences. And they're at One Poseidon, I think at One Poseidon Street, he said, or something like that. Anyway, where their offices are. Very interesting. If you live in Cyprus, drop in, say hello. Tell them, oh, I feel devastated for your plane falling. Yes. So basically, this guy is got his company registered there, which is a subsidiary of Meridian, the US company, which few, let's say, ex-CIA and other people that are basically involved in that entity. So it's a quite interesting thing now. Well, these arms, Western arms that were supposedly going, well, Zelensky is heading off for a Miami villa in the not too distant future as this unsuccessful, let's wear out Russia war and use the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder, which they've been used very successfully by their illustrious leader Zelensky. Such a humanitarian, but he's going to be looked after. Don't worry, guys. He's going to have a nice little villa in Miami. He's going to be very well looked after, while the rest of you Europeans can basically just turn off the lights, because that's all you'll be able to do. So these interesting characters are basically, enjoying the benefits of these geopolitical games at your expense, while your fuel prices are going up, your food prices are going up, and everything else is going up. And they printed shitloads of money. 2 years, $11 trillion. Okay. In Australia, about $1 trillion, which is about, nearly probably about at this stage about 60% of GDP. Not a small amount, guys. Yes, COVID payments and all that sort of stuff. So it's all this nonsense. The woke agenda has cost us heavily. Most people say, oh, well, you know, it's just people's opinions and all that. No, it's not. It has true world ramifications. And the ramifications is your energy is more expensive. Your food is more expensive because your transport costs have gone up by 4 times. I mean, the Vagoons should be devastated. Their kibble is going to become more expensive. Poor Vagoons. Yes, I know. Well, you've got to feel sorry for them a bit. And then all the sad dieters out there, which is the majority of the population, they're going to take a kick in the teeth as well as a consequence. And the thing is, you can't print money because you'll debase, you'll actually cause even more problems, more inflation. It's a supply issue, can't be fixed very quickly. You know, you can't get more oil or gas out of the ground. And all these lunatics out there are not saying, you know, what are they saying? Let's cut further back. And it's time to shift, you know, it's time to basically conserve energy and shift because we need to move away from that nasty, nasty gas and oil that's coming from the Ruskies. You know, that's our problem, apparently. It's just crazy stuff. You know, let alone Greece is another lunatic country. You know, their leaders basically are completely and utterly brainwashed. That's another woke central country. You know, I hope the Greek people rise up and just kick all those politicians out. But apparently now still the propaganda is very strong there from the media and all that. And most people are completely oblivious of that reality. I mean, most of that oil and gas, if you take a look, it's got very low sulfur content. I mean, where does it Crete or border? Well, Crete borders, you know, Libya. And Libya, we know from historical, it's got the sweetest oil and gas. It's low sulfur, low refining costs. It's the cheapest energy, petrochemical energy you can get. You know, Libya's got large parts of it, but in the civil war, they can't tap into enough. And Greece has got shitloads, and it won't allow explorations. They've got all these woke policies, policies that were implemented by the lunatics in Brussels, and the Greeks rubber stamped them all through their parliament. And now you've got all these environmental groups and other lunatics that are going after to prevent companies exploration. There've been a whole lot of exploration licenses been held up in courts for years. The government could fix it. Right tomorrow, they could pass legislation changing all that legislation and removing all the obstacles, fast track things if they wanted to, but they don't. They are so welded to this lunatic agenda. And the only saving grace for the Greek people currently is that they've got more LNG capacity because they've got, you know, those LNG stations within the country, more than other European countries. Plus, remember the refining stuff that I said, that they refine shitloads of oil and then they bring it in, refine it, and then export it and play the middleman for the rest of Europe. So they have their lower. It's all about, let's redistribute the carbon credits and reduce the carbon footprint. Greece has a less manufacturing, produces less. We can afford to do refining there for the rest of Europe. And that's what actually happened. And in that regard, Greece is a bit lucky because they can access cheaper stuff because it's refined in country, you know, because they're actually importing way more than they're actually and exporting petrochemical products way more than, you know, they're actually taking out of their own ground. They're getting it from elsewhere. They're playing the middleman in this whole game. But they could actually become a major energy producer of a lot of very cheaper. They could have energized the entire European Union. They could lower their debts over a decade. They could probably wipe them out. Plus, they could provide a lot of cheap, low cost, because of low refining costs due to low sulfur levels in their energy supply, petrochemical products. You know, could transform Europe. Do you think that's going to happen, guys? Nope. As long as the lunatics in Brussels are against it, Greece will not exploit its own resources. And, Europe will be getting petrochemical products, a very small amount from the US, which costs 4 times. And on top of that, they'll be, literally turning off the lights. Isn't it funny? Germans were putting in the boot into the Greeks, and here's the Greeks saying to the, like in Crete, there's a mayor there saying, "Why don't you come down to Kanya? We've got all these homes that basically we just rent out in the summer season to tourists. Why don't you come down and live here? Work remotely, work from a distance, and in Crete where it's subtropical, and not freeze to death in Northern Europe." So that's nice that people are making that offer and mentioning it. I don't think if it was the reverse that it happened the other way. But anyway, I'll leave that without getting into European politics too much in that regard, because it wasn't the current government, it was the previous government, and Merkel and her nutcase Soyberg that yes, even though they set up a lot of these systems that would fail, were prone to failure, them and the Brussels mafia, unfortunately. But, that's the world we live in. It's a crazy world, boys and girls. But, now you've learned a bit about what really happened with that Antonov aircraft, but also the nonsense about, it's the Russians, it's the war in Ukraine. No, it's not. The percentages are very small. It's only, as I put in that other video, which I'll put somewhere down there, that as well. It's pretty much down there. It's pretty much the the supply chain disruption and the underinvestment in oil. I mean, remember when oil actually dropped to minus $40 a barrel? This is what the Davos people wanted. Let's destroy oil production in the world. Let's force people to stop investing in petrochemical products. They got their way. They really damaged the oil and gas sector. They got their way. And now the rest of us are reaping those results. And basically, people are going to suffer. So, yes, now you really know what really caused it. And I think you need to get the message out to other people that those people, the Davos lunatics, their henchmen, and all those bankers and tech billionaires that push this agenda, they are the ones why you're going to be cold in winter, freezing to death, and struggling to put food on your family's plate. So just remember that. And so next time you go to vote, remember not to vote for those cockwombles, and to basically think carefully. Don't go for the extremists because they just want to destroy everything. They got no solution. But there are other people in the middle, reasonable, that actually pointed these things out. In Greece, there's, El Nikilisi, there's one group, and they tend to be, they're centre right, but there are in other parts of the Europe, there are centre left people that basically have got similar ideas and realise that all this woke agenda has just been very destructive for Europe. Find the people closer to the centre that have got a reasonable idea and not hostile to, to coal, oil and gas, and realise that, it's not going to happen. If you look at the stats, there's not enough lithium to basically build and enough of the rare materials and all that to build and replace every single car on the planet. It's not going to happen. There's not enough of these materials to basically build all the windmills and solar farms. So the only other option is nuclear. And even if you went all nuclear, you still wouldn't have, you'd probably have, let's say we went completely 100% nuclear, you've got about 20 to 30 years. So really the only other option is fusion power, which that's going to be some years away. And the closest option is an old technology that got abandoned because you couldn't get weapons grade plutonium to build bombs. That's the whole reason for nuclear reactors. You know, energy, yes, on the side, but the bombs are the important stuff. Yes, the bombs. Geopolitical power. I can nuke you, you know, that sort of stuff. Well, the thorium molten salt reactors, that's the only alternative. And we have enough thorium. Well, we've got enough waste material to put it through a thorium reactor, so we can get rid of all that really nasty nuclear waste. And then on top of that, and also the weapons grade plutonium and stuff like that, we could get rid of all that as well in a thorium reactor. And then after that, we could start using thorium material. And we've got enough thorium material to basically, I mean, only Australia has got enough thorium in its soil to basically power the world for well over 40,000 years. Yeah, 40,000 years. I think by that stage, we'll have probably mastered the ability to get out in space and produce and utilize fusion power and stuff like that by that stage. But if we were struggling to get to the fusion future, we've still got plenty of energy in terms of thorium. We've completely electrified the whole economy. Because ultimately, petrochemicals, we are at peak oil. Whether we like it or not, we eventually at some point would have to transition away from petrochemicals. Just not enough. You know, most reserves, like even the Saudi reserves and all that, they can't really increase production. And they've got budgets to fulfill. They've got a population that's basically grown up getting all these handouts. And in that way, the king is able to keep the peace in the Saudi kingdom. Now, other parts like the UAE have diversified into tourism and other things like that. You know, for a more conservative society like Saudi Arabia, it's much more difficult. So they are transitioning much slower. But they can't increase production. You know, they say, well, you know, our reserves are only so much. If we start producing too much, we're not going to get enough value or return on our investment. And we need also money to transition. And they're right. You know, they're really in a difficult spot. But obviously also they're not very impressed with US policy towards them currently. You know, you've got Biden turning up there and criticizing the Saudi prince. Well, you know, it's not going to work really well. You can't go over there, bag them, and then actually ask them to increase production. They're going to go, oh, because we're friends? I mean, yeah, there's a problem there, communication problem, you know. Something that Trump could do, but, you know, Biden is just incapable, is just, maybe it's the dementia, I don't know, or the extreme wokeness that he's adopted in later years. But either way, it's a problem. But, you know, who could just say it? He probably should have sent somebody else, you know, or Pamela, you know, Harris, maybe send her over, muzzled, and just have the advisor standing next to her actually talking, you know. That probably would maybe work the muzzling effect with the Saudis. But yes, but the reality is, you know, I mean, things are a real bloody mess. And they were all created in the US of A, you know, so, and this started even before. Trump's just as responsible as well because, you know, he was in the COVID era and he could have basically put a stop to all this bullshit. But he went along because, I don't know, he felt intimidated, felt threatened, whatever, you know. He didn't do enough to basically say, this is nonsense, this needs to stop. And unfortunately, we've had these lunatics at the helm printing money like there was no tomorrow. And remember, a lot of that money through the COVID era was actually printed under Trump's presidency. So, you know, he had an option to say, nah, we're going to stop this, but he didn't. So while he's not a warmonger like the current president, so I've got a lot of respect for him for that, not wasting more, millions. But at the same time, he could have done more on the infrastructure side, more to try and create new deal for the American people, in terms of roads and rail and all sorts of things to increase productivity, but also create a lot of blue collar jobs that America is missing. So that could have happened and didn't. So, I mean, and now all we've got is from the current White House is windmills and solar farms. So it's not looking good for anyone. So pretty much we're in a mess of our own making. And that's what happens when you run a woke agenda, print shitloads of money, and basically underinvest in petrochemical products. We're in the mess. We are. And I can't see things getting any better, because it takes about, even if we start now, it will take about 2 years to get anything out of the ground. This crisis is going to drift on for about at least 5 years. Will it get worse? You betcha. Next year is going to be even worse than this year. And the early parts of 2024 will be quite extreme as well. Things will start recovering in 2025. So things aren't going to get, and how much, what sort of recovery? It's hard to say. It'd be great for the Davos people. Yeah. But remember, in the following years, you'll own less. The Davos people will own more. And apparently, as the story goes, you'll be happy. Well, you'll have your alternative kibble as well. That's as long as the Russians don't stop exporting. It'll affect the Germans more than anyone else, God. Can you imagine being depressed and not being able to drink beer in Germany? How awful is that? God, scandalous. It's enough to be angry. But yeah, basically, it's going to be a real absolute schmozzle, the future. It's not looking good, unfortunately, guys. But if people say, well, it's all the Ukraine stuff and all that, nah, it's a small percentage. It's the countries that I said, Egypt, the West Africa, the countries that bought Middle East, that bought grain supplies. The Middle East has got plenty of petrodollars, so they'll buy some of that stuff on the open market. So they'll be less affected. It'll be pretty much Africa that's going to be affected. Egypt, them being one of the primary bigger countries that are going to be affected in Africa, plus some of the smaller ones. That's where some in Southeast Asia, that's where a lot of the pain is. The people who have to now no longer can get their contracts fulfilled and have to go into the open market for food. That's where. Now, the rest of the world won't feel these pressures until much later, but they still will feel them. And the reason for that is because it's going to take some time before capacity comes back into the system so we can move things around and the transport costs come down again. Currently, transport costs are way too high. We need to rebuild the supply chain, and I see no policies, especially in the US, US and Europe being the two big centers. Where's the leadership? Oh, yes. Oh, that's right. Washington's run by somebody with dementia. I always forget these things, really annoying. Yes. And the Europeans can't get their act together. They're squabbling. It's all somebody else's fault. Well, currently it's all Germany's fault, even though the chancellor that was responsible is no longer there. And so Draghi pulled the pin and said, well, time to get out. This is going to get very dangerous. They're going to blame me. Now, the three major parties that didn't support Draghi, the Prime Minister of Italy, who's the ex European Central Bank the head of the European Central Bank. So Lagarde is now over there. She'll print more money. They'll save us, according to the Davos people. And they know best. And pretty much when we look at the situation, rebuilding the supply chain is going to take a number of years. Rebuilding the energy side of things is going to take a number of years. This is a 3 to 5 year crisis, severe crisis. So what I'm saying to people, in particular in Europe, the rest of the world, we're all going to see some level of increased energy costs and food costs. Energy basically will affect all cost on everything, food and everything else. So it's going to be across the board. It's an energy crisis. It's not a credit crisis. It could turn into a credit crisis down the track. That's a different thing altogether. But currently, it's an energy crisis. We don't have enough energy, Scotty. And those warp engines are not working. So basically, really, that's our problem. It's underinvestment in cheap energy. It's what gave us the uninterrupted years after the Second World War, that great massive boom in productivity, that great massive boom in basically wealth. It's what gave us these modern things, modern computers and everything else, cheap energy. And basically the woke brigade said, poo, 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 poo on you, carbon energy. And basically by doing that and blackmailing, being the loudmouths, scaring, oh, the world's going to come to an end. The last time I remember the Cambrian explosion, 7,000 parts per million, the world didn't come to an end. It actually bloomed. Plants are carbon life forms. So are humans and many other animals. It bloomed. It was the biggest explosion of life the planet has ever seen. That was when the continent started breaking up and releasing a lot of greenhouse gases. And at the same time, the planet was in the right sort of orbits and all that to get more of that solar radiation and capture it. But as I said, even, and it wasn't, it's a lot of different things that were going into the atmosphere at that time. It was massive compared to today. That made the difference, where the amount now in the atmosphere is very tiny in comparison. With the overlap with the other greenhouse gases, it's primarily clouds and vapor, water vapor, that has the biggest effect. And it really has to do with the way our planet moves in its orbit and its interactions and the solar activity. As I said, solar activity precedes the gases. And what happens when the planet cools down? It absorbs carbon into water. Why do you think the permafrost, when it melts, it releases a lot of carbon and methane? Because it's been stored in there. This is well-known physics 101. Cold water stores and hot water releases carbon. The biggest carbon sink are the oceans. So if you're getting an increase of carbon inside the oceans, that means the planet is cooling, not warming. Got it? If it's going the other way, that's why there was so much solar activity at that point. This 3.5, the extra tectonic plate movement that actually increased the density, plus it was a different atmosphere back then, plus the density, plus the effect of that extra solar radiation. But it didn't get, like massively warmer You know, there were still periods when there were very high carbon levels, and there were, you know, ice at the poles, and there were periods when there was no ice, and there was much lower carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it doesn't correlate. But being the oceans being the big sinks, they can absorb more when it gets colder, release more, and all that. What you get with carbon dioxide is not warming of the planet or cooling of the planet. That doesn't happen. You know, when the planet cools, it absorbs more in the oceans. When it warms up, it releases more. No, the extra carbon dioxide that gets sent out there actually is something that vegetation take up, animals take up. That extra carbon actually builds more life. Doesn't warm the planet or cool the planet. That's the sun that's driving all that. What it does is it increases vegetation, life. Being against carbon is being against life. It's being anti-life. It's being, forget about misanthropists. It's basically, being in league with the devil, you could say. It's really being against life itself. If you're against carbon life, you're against life itself. You basically a supporter of death, because carbon is the stuff of life. You push carbon below 150 parts per million, all plants on this planet die. They die. We know that that's happened. We've had a period in where our orbit was such that the planet was getting far less, and the sun's activity was much lower. And we know that because we can actually go back in time to look at certain things. And we've extrapolated that when there was snowball Earth, carbon was captured in the water, in the snow, in the ice. And basically we had snowball Earth. Nothing could grow. And then, changing orbit, changing the solar radiation activity, and slowly it thawed out and released that carbon, and it bloomed more life. As I said, temperature rises before carbon gets released. Cooler absorbs. So it's associated. It's not the driver, it's solar energy that's actually driving the temperature. Always has been. But this is the reason, even though we're in this interglacial period, we're in a period, as the scientists call it, a carbon poor period. So if you ask any agronomist or people that deal with plants, they say plants are starving for carbon. This is why in hothouses they put like 1,000 parts per million into the hothouses to basically grow stuff. The reason why we've had famines and starvations in the past is because not enough carbon in the atmosphere to support. What we did with our industrial revolution, we released massive amounts of carbon. We greened the planet. The greening of the planet didn't happen before. If you go back in history and look back, there was far less greening. And we know that from geological evidence. We have greened the planet by releasing more carbon artificially. In the past, it would have just been the stronger sun would have released more of that carbon. For the majority of time, our planet has been a much cooler, colder place. We've only had certain periods. In the more recent times, our planet has been a very cold place in the universe. This interglacial period has just been a bit longer. And, the amount of solar radiation was just keeping about 180 parts per million back then. That's why crops failed. That's why things were very precarious. That's why people starved in ancient times and all that. Things were very difficult. Plagues and pestilence, low carbon environment. Obviously, it never fell below 150. Then we would have been hasta la vista, baby. What we've done is by increasing artificially, adding up to 400 parts per million, we've secured life on this planet in a period when, it's not as warm as in other past periods. So we've actually been able to, normally that extra, when it gets warmer, that extra temperature would release more carbon in the atmosphere from the oceans, the biggest carbon sinks. But that hasn't happened, but we've artificially done it, and we've bloomed the planet. We've created, even the NASA, vegetation, satellites that take images of vegetation have shown year on year an increase in vegetation around the world. Even though we're cutting down trees and doing all this sort of forestry and all that destruction, there's more plant life growing around the globe at stupendous levels because of the extra carbon. Yes, they should be thanking the petrochemical industry, the coal industry, for basically greening the planet, for basically actually enhancing life on the planet rather than demonizing these things. All they've managed to do is basically reduce our living standards, make us poorer, increase our inflation, and all these crackpots have done is to mask all these bad policies is to print more money. Now it's all caught up. The game is up. The game is over. That little game, hasn't lasted. Since the 70s, they played that game, free money, free credit. Now it's all coming to roost, pretty much. It's all coming to an end. And we're going to go back to a standard economy where it says, commodities, products like that. In Australia, we're pretty lucky because we're a commodities-rich country with a small population. So, but still, we're still affected. We're part of the global community, so we're still going to be affected to some extent, but not as severely as other areas, around the world. But the reality is, the woke agenda is the responsible agenda. Get that in your heads, guys. This is a crisis created by wokeness, pretty much, and central bank lunatics. Well, probably not lunatics is the right word, corrupt lunatics, that basically are looking for the big end of town. And they push the agenda of the carbon agenda as well. How crazy can you be when you need cheap energy to be able to print more money, to mask the money printing? And what do? They shoot themselves in the foot by making expensive energy, which means you're pushing up inflation, and the money printing problem becomes magnified. You can no longer hide it. Talk about an on goal by the financiers of the world. Yes, that's why we're in the mess we are, all this sort of stuff. So next time you go to the polling booths, remember what I've said. Find reasonable people that are basically think like this, and are not going to tear down the system, but are going to basically reform it radically and bring back some common sense, and hopefully there's enough of them there to basically make the difference. Or maybe we should basically ourselves become a bit proactive and get involved with some such groups and try and enhance their profile in our own communities. So it's not enough to basically jump up and down and moan about things. You've got to sometimes step up and take on the lunatics out there, because otherwise they will get their way and they'll make things even worse for us. Remember, things can get worse, much worse. As I said, let's hope we don't get to a scenario of lock and load. That would not be a world that I want to live in. Anyway, Yes. Keep your heads down and keep on the fight, the good fight against all these woke crackpots who are trying to make our world a very difficult place to live in. Anyway, see you guys. Oops, end.